There are many parallels between United States history and Russian history. In 1861, the same year that the Civil War began in the United States, 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, the Emperor of Russia, Alexander II, issued a decree that canceled the institution of Russian serfdom. Like the United States before industrialization, Russia was a primarily agrarian country, and its agricultural peasantry constituted between 40 and 50% of the population of the whole country. The serfs were not imported from abroad like slaves in the United States were. Russian serfs were ethnically Russian. In fact, most of the ethnically Russian population was enslaved under the imperial house of Romanov. The feudal system, in which landowners owned the peasants working their lands and the peasants' families, had been instituted in the early 18th century by Russia's first emperor, Peter the Great, as part of his sweeping campaign of economic and political reforms. By the early 19th century, Russia's non-parliamentary monarchic government was making motions toward canceling the institution of serfdom. Progress was slow, however, because, as can be expected in such cases, the government encountered an enormous amount of resistance from the landowning oligarchic class, the owners of the serfs and collectors of income from their own lands. The original plans, proposed in the days before Alexander II, had been for a nationalization of all agricultural property, along with the serfs, which naturally didn't please the landowners at all. By the 1850s, even though through several stages of government intervention the serf population had been reduced from 50% to 35%, peasant revolts began to sweep the country. The father of the legendary novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, for example, was murdered by his own peasants. And this is not a terribly unusual scenario for this period in Russia's history. Finally, Alexander II's government arrived at an economic compromise that would allow the emancipation reform to go through in a way that let both the government and the landowners make money from it. Instead of nationalizing the land and the peasants outright, the peasants would be granted the status of indentured servants, who would continue working on the lands of their former owners as technically free citizens, and could buy out their former owners. The government granted vouchers for 37-year mortgages on the land the peasants would receive, with 5% yearly interest to be paid out through a special bank founded for that purpose. Naturally, the landowners would receive shares of this income as well. Like any peasant class, however, Russia's peasants traditionally had many children. This presented a major problem only 1 or 2 generations later, when the children of the serfs who had been freed found themselves dividing their parents' lands further and further, until it was absurd to keep dividing the tiny plots. Thus, many of them ended up landless. The liberal reforms of Alexander II gave rise to the catastrophic growth of a whole generation of landless, disenfranchised peasants. Remember, there was no constitution or parliament under the Romanov dynasty, so there was no political recourse for these peasants. Their only option was to self-educate, self-organize, and take up arms. As it happens, there were plenty of socialists around who were more than willing to point the peasants seeking answers in convenient directions. They gave these disenfranchised peasants the gift of education by introducing them to the works of Karl Marx, which in turn inspired them with the historical perspective to comprehend their oppression and the outrage to devote their lives to overthrowing the oppressive Tsarist regime. Those who would provide the weapons and military organization to do so appeared out of the woodwork as well. No wonder one of Vladimir Lenin's most popular slogans at the height of revolutionary events in 1917 was "Land to the peasants." Next time, we will discuss the collapse of the Russian monarchy and the other events of 1917 in Russia.